Good evening. Thank you so much for being here and for joining us online. I know we have quite a few families who are choosing that option, especially as they travel during the summer. So my name is Father Brandon Farrar, the pastor here. I've been here about a year and a half or a little bit beyond that. It's an exciting time for us as we prepare to take the next step with our projects, which includes discerning our way forward with the curriculum and approach for our academy. So that's part of what we're doing tonight. We're here to learn and to listen from these gentlemen, to listen to the Spirit, and then hopefully to get a little response to the solicitation for interest in enrolling. So the way that we'll proceed is just start with a prayer, do a little introduction, then they'll present for 45 minutes to an hour or so, and then take some questions at the end. And then we'll have at least one announcement at the end, kind of a meet and greet to kind of develop the community around the academy. So listen for that. If you're joining us online, there are, let's see, some notes, show notes for the YouTube live stream. There are two links, and that one is to the handout that they will use this evening, and all of you hopefully picked one up. If you didn't, it's right there. And then also there's a link for an interest form for enrollment. So please follow those. Good. One mic works for sure. Yeah. Good. Let's begin in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord, your servant and Saint John Newman said that every child is entitled to an education that is consonant, consistent with their nature. So we're here this evening to listen for your Spirit, its promptings. Help us to understand what's being communicated, to respond to those promptings that you send to us, so that we might educate the children entrusted to our care to the fullness of our abilities. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. So I'm grateful to have both Dr. Edward Mulholland and Dr. Andrew Salzmann here from Benedictine College. Dr. Mulholland holds a doctorate in philosophy from Rome's Pontifical Gregorian University, the one that I chose not to go to. I'm sorry. I went to the Angelicum. And an MA in classics from the University of London. He's been involved in Catholic education via seminar, college, and high school teaching for 25 years. He's taught in Italy, Spain, Mexico, and the U.S. Currently holds the Sheridan Chair in Classics at Benedictine College, where he heads the Classics Department and co-directs the Great Books program, The True, the Good, and the Beautiful. Dr. Andrew Salzmann holds a doctorate in Historical Theology from Boston College and an MAR from Yale Divinity School. He's Associate Professor of Theology at Benedictine College and the Director of its Sheridan Center for Classical Studies. So he lives in Atchison, Kansas, with his wife, Sabeth, and their 4 children. So, Dr. Mulholland and Salzmann, welcome.
I was going to say, there's 2 firsts for me tonight. First, I think it's the first time, even though I have been in this parish before. So my son lived in Olathe on 158th until relatively recently. But to be in a parish named for a saint that I met personally.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Because the years when I were in Rome were kind of the meat of the JP2 pontificate, 1988 through 1992. And the second one is to sit in a pew that I have sat in somewhere else. Because I know the pews that you have in front came from Sacred Heart in Atchison, and so same with the ambo and the altar. And you know, it's just something that happens as populations go one place and populations develop in another place. But when you build something well and you build something to last like this, I mean, the fact that these pews are going to outlast the building is pretty amazing. They'll probably outlast this building. And I think, in a way, that is an apt metaphor for classical education and classical studies. It's the right materials, it's built well, it's built solid, and in a way that is going to outlast the fads and fashions of different generations.
So thank you for inviting us to come and talk to you. Father, thank you for that prayer and invoking John Henry Newman and his kind of idea of an education that is fit for your nature. So that's kind of a lot of what we want to talk about today, the idea of an education that is fit for our nature. Now I have bad news for you. I'm a theologian. So a pastor is going to say something like an education that's fit for your nature that people understand. But I'm a theologian, so I say, pedagogy follows anthropology, which means the same thing, but nobody knows what it means. So I apologize in advance for all the ways in which I'm going to be a theologian who says things.
I'm here to do simultaneous translation.
Who says annoying multi-syllabic things. But the kind of the first thing we wanted to start off by talking about is the idea that, and you've heard this before, it's not news to you, but the idea that parents are the primary educators of their children. And what any school is here to do is to help you as you educate your children. Your doctor hands you this baby, and you're like, oh my gosh, I have to teach it how to, be an adult eventually. And that's a terrifying prospect. And so schools are fundamentally there to help. On your handout, I put the quote from the Catechism of the Catholic Church that tells us about this. The fruitfulness of conjugal love extends to the fruits of the moral, spiritual, and supernatural life that parents hand on to their children by education. Parents are the principal and the first educators of their children. In this sense, the fundamental task of marriage and family is to be at the service of life. So parents are the primary educators of their children. And it's the work of parents to kind of form those people, form those souls for life and for supernatural life, for their life with God. And so I want to kind of start by emphasizing that it's fundamentally the parents' job to form the souls of our children with virtue. And one of the things that Father Farrer had mentioned is, he wanted us to emphasize the connection between what classical education is trying to do is the very same thing that all parents are trying to do, to help their children grow in virtue, to form the souls of our children. And there's a book that I found really helpful. We did it in our family group at my parish, called Family Virtues. I mentioned the name on your handout. That kind of is a really nice kind of introduction to, or reflection on the kind of ways that we can develop the primary virtues in the souls of our children. And so in this book, they say, since educating children is a necessary continuation of paternity and maternity, the mutual participation of both spouses is needed. The educational mission is proper to the couple inasmuch as they form a marriage, and it should never be forgotten that all who assist in the task of education, teachers, pastors, youth leaders, do so as collaborators with the parents. And I think this is really fun because it means that education is something that we do as a family. It gives the family, it's one of the ways that family has common work together. And this is something I've been thinking about. It's going to sound a little bit like, thoughts with Dr. Salzmann and Dr. Mulholland. And another thing. But one of the things I think is important for a family life, right, is to have work that you do in common. And the work of education is one of those things. If our children never see us work, kind of the work of education or any other kind of work, then the home becomes a place that's mostly about relaxing and recreation. And family life becomes mostly about spending time together doing fun things, and that's important. But it's not everything, and that's not a full picture of what adult life looks like that we're giving to our children. So sharing in the direct work of education as the primary educators of our children, it gives the kind of family life a mission, a sense of focus, a sense of direction that is exhausting, but also, I think, beautiful.
Miranda Lambert has a song, "The House That Built Me," that I remember the first time I heard it. You know, buried the dog behind there. The new family has no idea that it's there, right? But at the end of the day, it's not the house that builds you; it's the family, and first and foremost, the parents. When we talk about primary educators, it's easy to misunderstand that as first educators in time, like 0 to 6, right? And then we outsource that, and it's not our problem anymore. No, primary means you're on the hook for it eternally, right? Like that's on the question sheet for getting into heaven as parents. And you'd be like, no, it was the whatever school that we send the kids to and whatever. No. You sent the kids to that school. You're on the hook for this. I sent you these 2 guys to give this presentation. You're supposed to pay attention. No, so primary in that sense, that anybody else involved in the educational process does so as a collaborator with, right? Because we're in a world politically now where parents are seen as intruders in the educational process, and that is foreign to the thought of the church.
But, all right, so we've mentioned a couple of times, like you have to form the souls of your children. And that word soul can sound kind of funny to us, right? Like it's amorphous. What is a soul? If things ever get really rough, I guess I could sell it on eBay. But aside from that, like what is a soul? And actually the soul is something that we as Catholics have a very concrete picture of. It's, in a sense, a soul is another thing. Another word we could use is your mind. A soul is a mind that causes a body, in a sense. And so when we talk about the soul, we're talking about something very specific, and it gives you the ability, it acts in certain ways. And so if we're going to form the soul, the church says, let's talk more about what the soul is. And how can we do this? Well, the soul is made in the image, and this is where, I warned you, I'm a theologian, and you're going to get Trinitarian theology, and I would say I'm sorry for that, but I'm not. So the soul is made in the image.
Especially the day after the Feast of the Holy Trinity.
The day after.
Yeah, wow.
Is made in the image and the likeness of God, but God's a Trinity. So your soul is triune. It's got we often talk about the 3 powers to the soul. And we get this, especially from St. Augustine. St. Augustine says God's the Father who creates all things. And all the things that the Father creates, we hold in the treasure chest of our memory. And so just like God creates many things, we can hold that in those many things that we encounter in the world, we hold them in our memory. And God is the Son. The Son is the way and the truth and the life, the idea that kind of comes from the Father, that proceeds from the Father. And so we talk about the Son as being the reason, the logos, the Word of God. And so we have an intellect that can hold the truth, that can hold the reasons that God has used to organize the world, that can hold the words that we use to think. And so we have a memory, and we have, the fancy word, I guess, would be intellect, the ability to think through a thought, to ask if something is true. We have a memory, and we have an intellect. But the Holy Spirit is the love that is kind of the love between the Father and the Son, and the love, St. Paul tells us, that God pours out into our hearts. So our souls must have a third side, a third kind of dimension, and that's love, a will that can love things that are good. So when we say that you have a soul, what we mean is you have a memory that you can hold a thought in, you have an intellect that you can use to think about the truth, and you have a will that can love the things that are truly good, that you know are good. And this gives an educator a bit more firm of a job description. Let's form, let's shape, let's enhance your memory, your intellect, and your will. So for a Catholic, when I said at the beginning, anthropology, your idea of what it means to be a human being, shapes your pedagogy, the way that you teach. What we mean is that the way that you teach and the goals for your teaching and the way and your methods for teaching are grounded in this idea that you have a memory and an intellect and a will. And a good education, a good way of educating has to be aware of that. That is what the human person is. And all of education, we can say, is, in the Catholic view, virtue-based education. We want to build up the virtues, the strong habits of your memory, the strong habits of your intellect, and the strong habits of your will. So that you have good patterns, good habits, good habitual ways of remembering, good habits, strong habits of thinking, and good, strong habits of feeling and wanting. So we're trying to build up the virtues that perfect your soul. And that's the beginning of all Catholic education.
I think it's important to realize that not everybody's trying to do this, right? It's important that, when you see how the sausage is made, it's important to realize that they're trying to make sausage, right? I mean, fundamentally. Because if it comes out as sausage and they're trying to make something else, well, that's even more problematic. So this idea that the fundamental purpose is to develop as images of God 1 and 3, and that each child is a unique and unrepeatable image, like a facet of a diamond that reflects light in a completely unique way, is the cornerstone of the whole project, all the church's thought about education, right? And that's very different from thinking that the purpose is to fulfill a role in society or to kind of have the threads put in you so that you can be a cog in the machine, right? Now, are we built to be something greater than ourselves, to be part of something greater than ourselves? Yes. God himself, ultimately, right? I worked at a small classical boys' school in New York that said on their brochure, I'm not sure it says it now, but it said, for boys who dream of Harvard and heaven, right? I'm not sure those dreams are compatible these days, but that was the idea, right? So there's this idea that by developing those powers of the soul, it will lead to excellence as a human being, right? And excellence as a human being means success in this world and success in the next one, right? Sanctity. So it's really important to realize that even when you go into a classroom and things look, it's the same alphabet around the walls and maybe some of the same learning materials, it may be a fundamentally different project that is going on.
So the way that I became interested in education and classical education is, I'm a theologian, as I said, and I was reading a book that I found. It was just kind of like I went to a library, they're giving away a book. It was on the history of education. And I thought, well, that's interesting, I'll read that through. And I was reading it through, and I got to a chapter on one of the kind of major thinkers in the history of American education. And his name was John Dewey. And I'd heard of John Dewey's name, but I didn't really know much about what he had to say. So I read this section, and it said, until John Dewey, we used to think about education as, and about students as having faculties like memory and intellect and will that we had to perfect with habits. But John Dewey realized that that's not the case, and so now we don't do that anymore. And I thought, oh, that hurts. I don't like this. Who is this guy? So I did what a professor would do, and I got a copy of specifically his democracy, his Education and Democracy. Education and Democracy. And I said, well, let's see what John Dewey has to say. And so I was going through it, and he says, all right, there are kind of 3 goals for education. And the 3 goals for education start with this. First, as you can see on your handout, is to introduce the child to society, kind of socialization. And we hear that a lot. But this is how John Dewey puts it. He says, the first goal of the social organ that we call the school is to provide a simplified environment which selects the features that are fairly fundamental and capable of being responded to by the young, and then we establish progressively kind of a way of interacting with society. So you go to school so you can kind of learn how society works and what they expect of you. And you pretend to go to the store and buy food with pretend money, and then that prepares you to be able to go to the grocery store with mom and buy real food. All right. Fair enough. The second goal, he said, of education was to eliminate unworthy features in the environment. It is the business of the school environment to eliminate, as far as possible, the unworthy features of the existing environment from influence on mental habits. Every society gets encumbered with what is trivial, with dead wood from the past, and with what is positively perverse. And so it's the function of the school to remove from kind of culture the things that the educators, the people who run the school, think don't belong in culture anymore.
Right, like this dead wood right here from the past.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And the metaphor of what a pew would be. Mm-hmm. Right? So this is the second goal of the school. And then the third one, he says, is to integrate people, integrate society into a single kind of organism, so that you intermingle people from different backgrounds, different customs, into a new and broader environment. And this is, these are all, especially that one, is the reason why we have a Catholic school system. The goal that Dewey laid out was, to kind of teach students that, religion shouldn't be a defining element of people's public lives. And the Catholic bishops said, we actually do want you to be a Catholic citizen, so we're going to start, a parallel school system so that we don't train kids out of the idea that faith is a difference that matters. And so this was kind of Dewey's project. And it was all built on this idea that the most important goal of school is to create the society that we want, to create the future country that we want right now. And to plug, like Dr. Mulholland was saying, each person into society. So that, as Dewey says, we fundamentally look at ourselves as belonging to the broader society. We associate ourselves with the needs of society. But the needs of society is like any other organism, and the needs of society will change over time. So he was influenced by kind of social Darwinism, and Darwin would say, like, you have to adapt to the changing environment. And a society is just like that. It has to adapt to the world as it changes. Maybe it was important to teach kids how to spell once upon a time when we didn't have dictionaries or Grammarly. But now we have those things, and we don't need to teach kids how to memorize spelling. And so, my students make fun of me all the time. If you had a class with me, you might remember, I cannot spell. I am very bad at it. Because when I was in school, I would go up to my teacher and I would say, how do I spell this word? And my teacher would say, well, I don't know. How do you spell that word? go back to your chair and sound it out. And this was literally an example that Dewey uses. He says you can waste kids' time by making them like focus on how to spell a word. He says you can make them neurotically focused on spelling words, but this just means they'll be good at spelling words. And who does that help? It doesn't help anybody. So don't do it. Don't teach them how to spell. Don't spend a lot of time on this. It's not important.
And now you don't even have to write papers, because you can just tell ChatGPT to write me. I know you would have loved to have this back in the day, right? You know, write me a 5-page paper on Augustine's vision of the soul. And, you know, it'll even make up footnotes for you. It'll get them from wherever, but it'll make them up for you. It's amazing.
Makes me so sad. All right, so...
No, but I mean, I'm joking, but people are advocating that.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's that exact same mindset
Yeah.
that would look down on spelling and say, well, now we don't need to do that.
We don't
now
need
we
to-
all type and text.
Mhm.
So most of my students cannot write cursive. Yeah, most of the people I teach cannot write cursive. Like, what is that? Is that, you teach Greek? I'm like, no, that's cursive on the board. Sorry. Put it in block letters.
So all of this comes down to his anthropology. I was reading along, and I got to the part where he talks about this idea that there are no powers of the soul. He says, it is important to point out that the supposed original faculties of memory, willing, thinking, etc. are purely mythological. There are no such ready-made powers waiting to be exercised and trained. There are only neurons. And that's a materialist view of the human person. You're just neurons. And a neuron fires, but you can't train it to fire in a more excellent way. It's zeros and ones. It either, it fires or it doesn't. You have a sense reaction or you don't. And so you don't have to worry about developing excellence and virtues if you have a materialist view of the person. And so, there's no broader perfection that comes from learning, memorizing words, learning how to spell. If you memorize a bunch of words, if you learn how to spell well, then you're good at that and maybe a little weird because you've over-specialized in something kind of useless. If you become really good, Dewey would say, at writing essays, you've mastered something that we no longer need because we have ChatGPT to do it for us, and it might make you a little kind of over-focused on how to write. And you get obsessed with footnotes and weird stuff like that, and you waste your time, right? So there is no kind of broader virtue that comes from perfecting your memory with spelling, and there is no broader virtue that comes from learning how to write a paper that makes sense. So don't do these things. Society doesn't need them, and it doesn't perfect you more generally. Now, hopefully by this point in time, you've kind of seen where I'm going with this. If you do think there is such a thing as a soul, if you are not a materialist, if you do believe that you have memory and intellect and will, that when you have habits and virtues are perfected more broadly, if you do think that memorizing or learning how to memorize some spelling words will train your memory so that you'll be better at memorizing other things, if you do think that writing a 5-page paper about the soul in Augustine on your own and not using ChatGPT will help you to research other topics, then you would disagree with what Dewey is saying, and your whole model of education would have to look different. Dewey is not just some random guy whose name you haven't heard before, maybe, or you've heard a couple of times, but he is, the most influential American philosopher of education. And so, to kind of go down the path of Dewey is to go down a way of looking at the human soul or the human person that is very different and changes the actual things you do in a classroom. So a classical education is going to say, unlike Dewey, we think that there are things that are classic. And by classic, we can say 3 things. Classic means something that stands the test of time. Spelling is a classic thing for kids to do. because it's always going to help form their little minds. Moby Dick is the classic book to read because it's always going to kind of, or my kids were just watching 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. That's a classic story because it's always going to speak to our desire to kind of like fit into society or not fit into society or be brave and explore. It will always tell us something about human beings. So if there's a classic, then there are some things, some tools, some books that society will not outgrow. And why is that? Because the second sense of classical, we believe that there is something about being human that is always the same. There's a stable human nature. People born today are different than people born 2,000 years ago because we have, electricity and stuff like that, but we're fundamentally the same. We're all fundamentally human. We share a human nature.
There's a moment in Homer's Odyssey where somebody takes, there's a child there, and somebody says that the person was spinning around, and they were spinning around like a top. And I always pause the class at that point and say, does that jump out at you at all? I said, no, I've heard the term spinning like a top. I said, yeah, but it means they had tops. Okay. It means they had toys, right? So children played, right? These are not unrecognizable people from the past, right? And I think that there's a modern bent to look at the past as that dead wood, as everybody who's gotten it wrong and we've finally gotten it right. It's kind of a narcissistic obsession with our own righteousness, right? But there's kind of a commonality and a universality of humanity in the classical outlook. So, I mean, the word where we get it from is the Latin word for the fleet is the classis. And so the miles classicus was the fleet soldier, the marine, right? Somebody who was so good at hand-to-hand combat that he could do it on a boat, right? The people that would board and win a sea battle. That's your miles classicus. Or the person that you're going to land on the shore and, projection of power ashore. That's always important, right? But it then came to this meaning of what you would put on the fleet. So if you were going to form a colony, right? And this goes back to the Greeks too, because the colony was not supposed to look like Greece. The colony was supposed to look like a little Sparta or a little Athens or a little Corinth. Right? So it depends on the towns in Sicily and the towns in southern Italy. What are you going to bring with you that is definitively who you are? Right? So let's say, okay, you're going to do a little starter kit, right? Or we use the word. We use the word. Something happens. Somebody does something, whatever. And I'm like, classic Loosbrock, right? Oh, that was absolutely classic, right? In other words, extremely representative of who the person is, right? And so the classics are the best that we have to offer from our tradition, right? And set in a way that is so beautiful, it can be retained. It brings up certain questions with prompting, because that's our job security, right? For a young person to think about themselves and think about the world and think about what they are supposed to be as human beings.
So there are these classics, these kind of best ways. I guess today we would call them best practices because they've stood the test of time. And in education, the classics of education are what we call the liberal arts. The liberal arts. This is a confusing word. People often think like liberal. Are there conservative arts? Are there like progressive arts? But liberal arts is it's not a political idea. It's the idea that there are certain things that you learn, certain skills that you learn, that are more helpful than other skills. When I was in school, let's say when I was in high school, they taught us kind of how to read a novel, how to follow an argument across a couple hundred pages. And they also taught me how to identify different kinds of elements by looking through a spectrometer. Did you guys do this? You look through the spectrometer and the what is blue? I don't remember what blue was. It was a bad time for me because I'm colorblind. So it was not fun.
Gosh,
and I
that
did not
and
do well.
spelling? This is therapy. This is therapy for Dr. Salzmann here.
It's very, cathartic. And the skill of how to identify elements using light spectrum was not super helpful. But the skill of being able to kind of follow an argument across a couple hundred pages, that was very helpful. I use that in many ways. And so there are some intellectual skills that we learn that are more broadly applicable than others. They are what we call the liberal arts because they free you, they're liberating, they free you from needing someone else to explain, how do I teach myself this? How do I learn this? What does this mean? Someone who's taught the liberal arts can learn for themselves. I have a quote on your handout, and I'm going to read it because it's from my man, Hugh St. Victor. Dr. Mulholland was teasing me on the way up here. He's like, of course you're going to talk about Hugh St. Victor. Hugh St. Victor wrote 800 years ago, speaking of classics. And this is what he said about the liberal arts. Out of all the sciences, the ancients, the people who were ancient 800 years ago, in their studies especially selected 7 to be mastered by those who were to be educated. These 7 they considered so to excel all the rest in usefulness, that anyone who had been thoroughly schooled in them might afterward come to knowledge of others by his own inquiry and effort, rather than by listening to, paying, a teacher. For these, one might say, these liberal arts, constitute the best instruments, the best rudiments, by which the way is prepared for the mind's completed knowledge of philosophic or highest truth. So the liberal arts are the skills you learn that best help you to learn on your own. And he says there's 7, and we divide them up into 3 and 4. 3 and 4. 3, trivium, which is just another way of saying 3, and 4, quadrivium. 3 ways and 4 ways. But today we would call them as kind of like language arts and mathematical and math. Language arts and math. The trivium.
Reading, writing, and arithmetic. Yeah.
Yeah, very good. The trivium, grammar, logic, rhetoric, you have to learn how to use words. And you have to learn how to think through with your intellect an idea. And you have to learn how to express it well to other people. Oftentimes, one of the biases or one of the misconceptions of a classical school is that they're going to only focus on language arts. You're going to read a lot of old books and maybe some Latin, but you're never going to learn any science or math. This is very wrong. So the whole second side of the liberal arts is what we call the quadrivium, which back in the day kind of meant arithmetic, music, geometry, and astronomy. But in a real way, we can say these are the quantitative things that you study. You have to learn science. You have to learn math. Sometimes when I'm talking to freshmen at Benedictine and they think of themselves as not being math people, this makes them very sad. But no, you can't get away with it. You can't get away from it. Because we want to free you to teach yourself many, nay, almost everything that you need to know for the future. And you can't do that without being able to think mathematically, too. And so classical schools, just to dispel this misconception, classical schools consider the mathematical and the scientific side of things to be inalienable from a good education. So the liberal arts, it doesn't have to mean just those 7 subjects, but it does mean that you're going to learn linguistically and you're going to learn mathematically and scientifically. And that both of these things are important.
I think when we talk about liberal arts, one distinction can be made is between the liberal arts and the so-called servile arts, right? And you're trying to produce something, right? So if you're trying to make a good lasagna, you're going to be judged by how good the lasagna is. You're going to be judged by the end product. The goal is to produce something outside the cook, so to speak. namely a lasagna.
Your arts are in the service.
Specifically, a good lasagna, right? Whereas in the liberal arts, the goal is the perfection of the individual. So I would argue that even though he cannot remember what blue meant on a simple spectrometer, or spectrometer, I can't even say the word, right? That since he's more of a word guy, that the skill of concentration in there contributed to the following the argument over 200 pages, right? Because one of the things that was being done, I think, give me a couple of minutes here. I think it's interesting that the fundamental divide is there a soul and does it have an actual structure? Because if there isn't one, then kind of anything goes, right? But what a lot of modern education does seem to get right is the material side of things, right? You go into a gym and there are all these machines and it actually has a diagram and says this is where it should hurt, because if it's hurting somewhere else, you're doing it wrong, right? So it's targeted for this particular muscle and it's targeted for a certain number of reps according to your body type and whatever. We've got that down pretty well to a science, right? But there is kind of what I call, in the language arts especially, in modern education, a myth of relevance, right? They're saying, no, you have to read something that's relevant. Like the purpose of reading literature is to make you feel a certain touchy-feely way about a certain social ill that has been chosen by the teacher or the superintendent or the higher-ups, whatever, right? And so reading a book that is just very good English, people don't understand. And I said, okay, why wouldn't I go into the weight room then in Benedictine when the wrestling team's in there and say, what are you doing? What are you doing lifting up these discs, these metal discs? You should be pushing around, wrestlers from Baker that are in your weight class, and you should be doing that, right? Or you go to the football team and said, you should be, pushing around defensive backs, etc., right? But everybody understands that this is an artificial, contrived circumstance, right? That is targeted for certain skills that we know exist, and everybody's fine with it. And you try to say that that same thing exists on the soul side, and people go crazy. They just don't seem to get it. And the reason why they don't seem to get it is because they don't get it. They don't believe it exists. Or if they believe it exists, it's kind of like everybody gets to say what their soul is and what their soul means. And that's just not true. All of God's creation, because it was created by the Father through the Son in the Spirit, has an order, has a meaning. There's where the logos is. And it has a sense and a meaning. And when we follow that order and when we follow that meaning, it reaches its fulfillment. It reaches its fruition. And so we try to say, okay, so this, reading this Shakespeare play may or may not have any application to something that the kid is going through at this particular moment in their life. Right, okay, everybody reads Romeo and Juliet in high school. And I'm like, oh yes, because, everybody has that problem, right? I'm in love with a girl from a rival family, and, people thumb their nose at each other, and, people are killing each other in the street, all right? That may or may not be part of your upbringing, right? Or you are, living in a fantasy island, in The Tempest. The point is that the language is beautiful. And through the beauty of the language and the rhythm of the language, it's going to open up vistas on humanity, anybody's, and then upon reflection, specifically your own. Right? The fact that you can apply it as soon as you get out of school is not what's fundamentally important, right? And by the way, most of the kids think that that's a joke anyway, right? When I try to talk to 16 and 17-year-olds, which I used to spend an inordinate amount of time doing because I taught high school and college at the same time, they kind of, it feels artificial to them, right? But one of the things that is essential, and I'm sure we're going to get to it, that the classics awaken is wonder, right? Notre Dame's philosophy department had a really good shirt a couple of years ago. It said, "Come with questions, leave with better questions." Okay? So, especially at the middle school, high school, you want to lead the child to ask the right questions and to ask them in a way that it becomes a question for them. Not just because it was asked, it's because it's important to me. I want to figure this out. Right? If nobody cares why the Civil War started, if that's not a problem for you, you're not going to want to read a textbook about the Civil War. But if you read Michael Shahara's The Killer Angels, and you're fascinated by the Battle of Gettysburg and the human relationships that are there, and how was it these guys are fighting against each other? They were roommates in college. Oh my gosh. They're talking about saying goodbye to each other in California just a year and a half ago. And that becomes a problem for you, then you're going to be able to swallow the tougher stuff, right? But it doesn't mean that there's going to be a civil war tomorrow that you're going to have to participate in, right? So that relevance is a myth and a dangerous one. But it boils down to the fact that the soul has a structure, it has certain faculties, and we know how this works and we know how to educate them because we did it for 1900 years until we forgot.
Yeah. So yeah, that's good kind of beginning to sum up. The goal of education is to build up good habits for our memory and our intellect and our will. And we can do that by using classics, the works from any field that have been proven over time to teach people most effectively and most deeply. Every field has a classic. There are classic books to read, but there are classic ways of solving a math problem. You know, when I was in school, the teacher would say, well, you know, solve the problem however you want to solve the problem. Just, you know, like try to be creative. And that took forever. And that's not necessarily going to be the most effective way of teaching someone to kind of do math well in the future. If you show up in a calculus class and you're going to like creatively solve things your own way, you know, you're not going to finish that exam in 75 minutes. So there are classic, better ways of solving math problems. There are classic ways, classic experiments in science class that you can do and better understand the world by experiencing those experiments directly. Every field has classics, best ways of introducing someone to the subject. And so we want to kind of teach children using these classics. So to kind of sum up, I wanted to end by looking at a couple of the methods. We've been talking about how you have a soul with memory and intellect and will, and that changes what you think about education and what you think about the goal of education. But it also changes the things you do, the methods you use to educate. So if you look at the bottom of your handout, we kind of say there are a couple of methods that classical schools often use. You have a memory. How can we improve your memory? And classical education will always use memory work, which means find the best of a thing, imitate it, commit it to memory, and then in the future, when you need to do that, whatever related thing, you have something in the treasure chest of memory. You have something in your heart that will form you to speak better, to speak clearer, to do math more quickly. The thing that has given my son this 6th grade year was a long journey, as 6th grade always is. And he was grappling with kind of like new concepts in math class. They were trying to do some like pre-algebra stuff. The saving grace of his 6th grade year was that I'd made him do memory, the kind of those math memory worksheets, every morning for like all of 3rd grade, and he could spit out those numbers immediately. And so knowing that strong memory foundation, he was able to kind of do something that was a reach for him. Memory work helps you in the world of mathematics, but it helps you in anything. You were telling about St. Martin's kind of use of memory at the high school level.
Yeah, I mean, so my son Patrick goes to a all-boys classical boarding school called St. Martin's Academy, which is in Fort Scott. And memory is a big part of it. They have to memorize these pericopes, they call it. There's a theologian word for you. Passages from the gospel, these 92 passages of the Gospel of Matthew, right? They're going to move on to another one. And you might think, why would you put yourself through this? I said, first of all, I'm not putting myself through this, I'm putting my son through this. So it's different. But the idea is you have that, and then you'll have it forever. The stuff that you learn during certain ages, it just gets so baked into the limestone that it's there forever. And if you have good stuff in there, it's in there forever. Well, why should we be memorizing something that we don't even understand? Well, first of all, do we even understand anything? There's the question. Fully, right? And if it's in there, you're going to be able to go back to it. You're going to be able to go back to it and go deeper and deeper and deeper. I remember a friend of mine who was a priest in England. Part of his seminary formation, I don't know why I air quoted that. I'll air quote this. Part of his seminary formation was they had to take one of their theology classes at a Protestant seminary. I don't know the purpose of this. But so he was with this study group and they were talking and he asked somebody a question and the person said, well, I haven't really worked out my Eucharistic theology yet. He says, really? I worked out mine when I was in 2nd grade. They said, really? I said, yeah. It hasn't changed. I mean, the fundamental truths are the same. They've deepened, right? They've branched out, they've deepened, but they haven't changed, right? And, having children memorize catechetical stuff, you're at a time, I mean, we talk about Dorothy Sayers' lost parrot stage and the pert stage and the poet stage for elementary and middle school and high school. And at a stage where everything is sing-songy and rhymey, if you get good stuff in there, it's amazing. It's amazing. And they're so happy to come and recite a Wordsworth poem for you.
Because the things that you memorize become your habits of thinking. And if you think about what people choose to memorize, by which I mean movie quotes, that makes you who you are. You take a little kiddo to watch Star Wars, and for the next, I was going to say hour, but instead I'll say 3 months. They will be like Luke Skywalker, or they'll be Ezra running around with a sword, because that is, or a lightsaber, because that is in their memory now, and that's shaping how they think and act. Now this is no diss on Star Wars, but you can put yet richer things still, in the heart, and that will come out in how you think about yourself and how you behave. So memory and imagination in that sense. But we have an intellect, and so we also want to teach people how things connect, how the many truths connect. And something that makes a classical education different from other education, other visions of education, is that you get many, many truths, but in a classical education, especially a Catholic education, we want to show how all those different truths that integrate or connect together. So that you can kind of see the world as a cohesive whole. And this is hard to describe, but what I mean by it is, you can take a biology class and learn about the brain. You can take a psychology class and learn about the mind. You can take a theology class and learn about the soul, like this is kind of almost a theology class. But how do they all connect together? How does mind and brain and soul connect? And in a classical school, we're not going to be able to describe right now how they all connect. But a huge part of a classical education in the Catholic tradition is what we call the integration of knowledge, how all these different truths connect. Otherwise, you're left with, sometimes in this classroom, this is true, the brain, what we say about the brain is true, but I don't know how that connects to the soul or the mind or anything else. So showing how all the different truths connect is an important part of a classical education in the Catholic tradition. Another kind of thing that makes classical education different from other forms of education is that it's very Socratic. And maybe your image of a classical education is that you're just going to be told what to think with more insistence on memorizing. But a classical education, ideally, is what we call Socratic. In that, the whole classroom is taught to question, how do you know that something is true? One of my good friends in the classical education world says that her goal is for a classroom to be as much student-directed as possible, so that by high school, the teacher is speaking maybe 20% of the time, and the students are badgering each other about what really is true 80% of the time, in what we call seminar-style teaching. But that has to begin, that begins even in kindergarten. So in a classical school, ideally what happens is you walk in, the students all walk in. On their desk is like, I don't know, like a statue of a frog or a picture of a frog. The teacher says, hey guys, what do you know about frogs? You have like a long discussion where all the kids, they're green and they're slimy. And then the teacher synthesizes. Like, you're right. You know something about the world, and you don't need to rely on experts to teach you about frogs. You just need to spend some time sorting it all out in a systematic way. And so a classical education actually is trying to empower students to say, I already know a lot about whatever you're trying to tell me about. And I know it from my experience of the world, and we're going to line it all up and teach each other and trust the authority of our own experience.
Yeah, I think that's important, going from the known to the unknown.
Right.
Right? Instead of, you have to, because even this happens, it's kind of a bad memorization. You have to memorize, these are the classic characteristics of all amphibians, right? You have to memorize this list, and it's not connected to anything, right? Let's just start with the frog. And it's something that's relatively familiar. It could be very, very familiar if you put a frog in the room, which is fine. It's actually better if they've actually been there and touched it. And then from there, from knowing the particular well, then that branches out to the universal. And that's how scientific knowledge progresses, and that's the scientific knowledge model in a classical class.
Good classical education will always put experience first. You're going to teach the first graders about like measurement sizes. Don't say anything. Just have a bunch of different half cup, 2 cup, tablespoon measures. Let them play around with water or sand for like 15 minutes, and then start asking them how many tablespoons are in a cup. It always has to be grounded in the authority of your own experience. So in that sense, it should be empowering, and it should be fun, experiential. Then we also wanted to talk about what does it look like for classical education, classical school, to form the will so that you can love. And here it means that in a Catholic school, there's going to be an emphasis on wanting the best for other people, and then wanting to give God the most, right? God first, but God through other people. But I don't want us to go too long, because I want the good for you. So let's go to the last, which is something that Dr. Mulholland already mentioned we're going to talk about, which is to say not just that the will wants the best for others, wants the truth for others, wants the good for others, but that we form the will with awe, because we'll never know everything. And awe, there's a technical definition of awe. Awe is when you glimpse something that you know is true and complex, but you can't fully understand it. It's just a little bit beyond your reach. And you feel a little scared by that, and you take a little step back, and you're like, wow, the world is more beautiful and complex, and God is more powerful and loving than I thought. I think we've all had moments where like the beauty of creation and the power of God were revealed to us as being just beyond our reach. And our reaction is to take a step back and in awe say, I'm a little intimidated by how beautiful, how wonderful, how powerful God is. And this makes me feel all the more in love with him. And so ideally in education that begins by forming your memory, training your intellect, and softening and strengthening your will, ends with you taking a step back and maybe kneeling down and praising God, ideally at the liturgy, for the world that he's given us. So ideally, the best Catholic education, the best classical education, ends in the liturgy. Now we're going to be a theologian one last time and use many syllables. The liturgical consummation of education. Friends, thank you very much for coming on a Wednesday evening to listen to a Monday. Sorry. I don't know why I said Wednesday.
School's out. We have a very different calendar.
What is time? I don't know. Coming on a Monday evening to listen to us talk. And we're happy to talk more, but we'll do it only in response to questions now. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you. If there are questions, maybe professors, if you could repeat them so that it goes through the microphone system for those watching. So if there are any questions, please ask away.
Yes?
You spoke a little bit at the end about a classical education within a classroom setting with, I assume, lots of kids. So for us,
Hopefully lots of kids.
right, lots of kids. For us and for the school that may potentially be still 2 years out, so some of us was a May homeschool where it's not a lot of kids. So what's the strategy around driving the classroom collaboration without a classroom? Setting full of kids, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, there's...
Repeat the
Yeah, so the question is, we've been talking about classical school. Classical education is not limited to schoolrooms. So what does it look like outside the classroom? And there are a lot of resources for classical homeschooling. And I think a lot of really promising venues and models for how to have kind of a collaboration between a school and a home or a learning co-op, say. But in the end, it's going to come down to a philosophy. We're going to kind of follow this ideal of experiencing things, thinking about them, burying them in the treasure chest of memory, imitating what's best, kind of trying to discover with awe the beauty in the world. And there are a lot of resources for doing this at home. Memoria Press is a classic example of a publisher that produces resources on how to do this well. And then, even in Kansas City, there are examples of classical schools that you only go to school for 3 days, maybe, and then at home you do kind of additional kind of directed work at home for 2 of the days, maybe. There's a very small, but kind of intriguing Orthodox school called Mount Tabor that's experimenting with that model here in Kansas City. So I guess the answer is there's lots of resources out there, and otherwise it's a very kind of you have to kind of dig into those resources to see what it looks like for you. Eddie, if you want to.
Yeah, I mean that's the decision that you're making.
Yeah.
Right, that you're going to have to make. What model to follow? I mean, there's classical K-8s that are doing very, very well. I know a pre-K through 12 in Georgia that I've worked very closely with called Don Bosco Academy that has the 3-a-day, 2-a-day idea. Grammar school is one, and then it switches over once you get into middle school and high school, which is interesting because then they can use the exact same building, right? So then when a certain group of students are there, the other ones aren't there, and you just have, you know, the smaller chairs that are up against the wall, and then they put the bigger chairs in there. And that school is really doing fantastic work. And then even for the parents, you know, because all homeschoolers are not created equal, right? There's this idea of we're homeschooling because we believe this is the best and this is the way to do it. We're homeschooling because no school really has the values that we are trying to form in our children, and sometimes trying to get those people to collaborate isn't the greatest. But I think that once everybody understands what's at stake, right, and then, you know, sometimes compromises need to be made. But I think fundamentally, the question that needs to be made is if you want to follow a classical curriculum. It's definitely not a one size fits all. It is malleable to a tremendous amount of permutations, whether it's homeschooling, whether it's a homeschool hybrid, or whether it's a K-8 or pre-K through 12.
I mean, there's just a stunning amount of creativity at work in the broader classical movement right now. So it's hard to, I can't tell you what it needs to look like. And also, you know, for any individual family, you have to kind of say, well, what about my kid? Different kids need different things. You know, some kids are just resolutely social. And the only way that you're going to kind of like be able to connect them to the kind of the world of learning is going to be in a more group setting. You know, other kids less so. So there's just a lot of there's a lot of variety.
I think you knowing what's best for your child is part of being the primary educator, and you doubt that sometimes. We all doubt it sometimes, but we have. Is it another theological term? We have a grace of state, well, hopefully a state of grace as well, which is different. But we have a grace of state as parents, as special assistants from God to know what's right for our children, right? And that's one reason to have a big family is you get a couple of mulligans, right? You know, you make some mistakes with the first couple. You know, I tell my oldest kids this all the time. You know, you make mistakes with the first couple, and then, you know, finally at the end, you know, things work out.
Right.
Things work out. Question?
So I know this is a big work at Benedictine to work on the education of the teachers. What does a classically trained educator look like? Because I think there's a deficit.
This is something.
And
Yeah.
particularly in the area of elementary education, in the area of kindergarten.
Yeah.
So very different. But so like, what do those educators look like, and what would a school like this?
So the question is, you know, what does it look like for the education of classical teachers? And
Funny you should ask.
it's funny that you should ask that because this is, in fact, a project that Dr. Mulholland and I have been working on for a year. We're launching master's courses, master's level courses, and a curriculum on forming teachers for classical education. And we've just hired a professor of classical education. So the answer to your question looks something like 36 credits of courses in teaching method. But there are, the thing that's kind of beautiful about the classical education movement at this moment is that it began fundamentally, although I gave you a lot of theological theory, it began as people trying new ideas, people trying practices, people experimenting. And over the last 20 years, we've distilled their practices into a set of kind of like a unique set of methods. And so just as any teacher would go to get an education degree, you'd spend time doing teaching methods courses. We have, you know, classical teaching methods, we can say, and kind of methods of teaching that are particularly for classical education. And you know, we're very excited about this coursework. Ultimately, what it looks like is things are more student-directed. things are more hands-on and more experiential. Things are, you're trying to prompt the student to do more of the work, more of the thinking, more of the analysis. And also you're trying to connect them with an existing tradition so that they kind of like identify where they are in the flow of history and feel connected to a broader tradition that gives meaning to their lives. So that's the kind of vague, quick answer. And the longer answer is 2 years of competitively priced coursework. Next question.
Yeah.
Oh, please.
I was going to say, I think one of the things that's key is first, it's an educator who understands the truth of the human person and loves it, and therefore loves the human persons in their miniature form that are seen there. There's a whole bunch of future saints, and that's your job to collaborating with the parents, right? But if a modern gym were a modern classroom, it would look like this. The person there is just doing these reps, saying, okay, this is how you do this. This is how you do these reps. We're going to count to 10, and then go, Gregory, why aren't you doing anything? Come on, Gregory. Joey. Sorry, anybody named Joey. They're always a problem, right? So what is this person doing? Right? It's like somebody, I say this all the time. Dr. Mulholland, what is this? I said, well, I could tell you the answer, but I already know this language. See, you're the one who has to do that. I'm like, look at your book. Look, it's not cracked. It's not cracked in the vocabulary section. That's a bad sign. People starting to buy used books now because they're into it. And I'm like, it must be used by the right type of person, right? So that you have to do the work. So when you go into a classroom and the teacher is yelling because the kids aren't doing something, very often it's because the activity isn't engaging, right? Because I think children know, even at that level, they know when something's interesting them, right? And they know when something, even in their, 5-6-year-old way, they know when something's benefiting them.
Here's one more thing I have to put into as an answer to your question. If you hang around classical education proponents for 30 seconds, or an hour if they're getting slow to getting around to it, they will say fewer things more deeply. Fewer things more deeply. So one way of thinking about like, oh wow, rigorous education would be we're going to teach them more stuff. Here's a longer list of things that the kids have to memorize or that the kids have to learn about. Let's add more empires to the list of things they have to learn in history class. That's how we know it's a rigorous education. That is not what a classical kind of teacher would say. A classical teacher would say, let's do fewer things, but more deeply. And this will look like a unit study where we're not going to talk about every empire, but let's zero in on the Roman Empire, but go and do it from many different angles in many different subjects. And by looking at one thing more deeply and more carefully, then you'll be able to learn something else more quickly later. So at Marhill in Atchison, they decided recently, let's have everyone learn Latin, and then you can still get to the same level, or maybe pretty far in Spanish, because you will have learned Latin more deeply, you will have learned Romance languages more deeply. The Spanish will come quicker. So the idea of fewer things more deeply is also very important. So, next question, yes.
Just in the U.S., how many board method schools have started and flourished? And my second part of that question is, when we get this started, how hard is it to recruit for faculty that are trained?
Okay, so this is a challenge. I have a couple statistics for you. A big classical school network that we've been working with is a group called the Great Hearts Academies. And they started in Phoenix, in Arizona, and they spread to Texas, And now they're spreading to Louisiana, and next up is Florida, and they think maybe after that, like, you know, Georgia. And we were putting together this degree program, and we were wondering, well, will they get jobs? And the guys at just one school network said, we need to hire 650 teachers a year for the foreseeable future. You know, the Chesterton academies are growing everywhere. Kind of, you know, I think most major cities in the United States at this point in time, it seems to like they have a Chesterton academy. So that's another kind of network of classical schools that is growing.
And even at the diocesan level, there's a lot of dioceses that are trying to go back to a more classical model within their diocesan curricula as well.
So there's been a lot of success with kind of schools and a lot of growth with schools moving in this direction, but recruiting teachers is challenging, to be honest, and there is a need for kind of deeper formation in classical methods, and so yeah, I mean that's a consideration. You know, like there needs to be some intentional planning about finding teachers.
Our master's is designed to do two things. It's designed to give the classical stuff to educators, right? But also to give the education stuff to classical people. So somebody that's done a liberal arts degree, somebody comes out with a philosophy degree. You don't want to let that kid loose in a first grade classroom.
But we
just sit there with a snifter of bourbon and talking to these kids about Aristotle, right? Yeah. You need to give that, you know, classroom methods, you know, you need to give them the nuts and bolts that they're going to have to do to do that.
It is possible to do. One of our best philosophy students, we asked him, so what are you going to do? He's like, well, I think I'll teach second grade. And I thought to myself,
this kid was brilliant.
Brilliant, smart. I mean, the best. I mean,
this kid published in the American Philosophical Quarterly as an undergraduate.
As an undergraduate. Right, so, but he's like, you're going to teach second grade, and I was like, I don't know. I'm a little worried for those second graders. But they, you know, if you're going to do a classical school, you have to have summer formation for these teachers, and they put him through. You know, he went to a great heart school. They know how to kind of onboard teachers, even ones who have no idea how to teach. And he's still doing it. He's still teaching. He had a very successful kind of, you know, first years. I mean, it was a lot of work. He's a well-regarded teacher. So part of the way that you have,
and he just got married. So
and he just got married.
Even that happened.
So you have to be intentional about finding the right person, and you have to be intentional about onboarding them and having the right onboarding program. And you have to be kind of like, it is very helpful to be open to people who are kind of from a wide variety of majors. Often what you'll hear is what matters is their curiosity and the breadth of their knowledge, and then having the right personality, and then giving them the kind of the tools they need to teach well before they get into the classroom. So. Yes?
So what are the advantages and disadvantages of having our educators go through 4 years and then have to go through another 2 of time and expense? Why can't we bypass the 2 years and train our current educators with the classical?
Yeah, I mean that's certainly something you can do.
We have a specialization in classical education at Benedictine in the elementary education program.
There's not a one-size-fits-all.
2 people have done it.
Yeah.
So, but here's the thing: once they see what that opens up for you in terms of the labor market, right? I mean, the boom in education is here. I say this all the time. The future of Catholic education is classical insofar as it has a future. Right? I mean, if the culture gets real bad, then, you know, when we're all in the work camp together, you know, at least it's the time people say, well, now I want to learn Latin because I've got, you know, nothing else to do. So my job's safe. But I'm hopefully not exaggerating. Or I know, I hopefully am exaggerating.
But there's not one size fits all answer. I mean these are all what we say prudential decisions, and there are definitely there are like you can do summer formation for teachers. You have already. We're doing some of that this summer ourselves, but this is not an ad. The Institute for Catholic Liberal Education does summer formation as well. So there's more than one way to get formation for teachers, so I guess the answer to your question is there are situations where that may make sense. There are situations where it may not make sense, and there are other ways to get that. Yes.
To my knowledge, we don't have a Catholic classical high school education program. What's the transition look like for the kids going from a classical 8th grade to a now you're in regular high school, quote-unquote, Christian high school? There it is.
There's one that's just starting in
So
in
rephrase
Kansas
the
City.
question.
But
And I would
nonetheless,
think there's some of the high schools here that certainly have elements of it,
yeah.
right? And I think there's an openness to be incorporating more of the elements of it. St. James certainly has.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. But it's not like you can't go to a kind of a standard high school after a classical grade school education. The hope would be that this would be excellent preparation.
You'd be better equipped than the other way around.
Yeah.
That was going to be my question.
I think you'd be better equipped than the other way around.
Yeah.
Let me share a little thing with you. So I went to, I was going to say pretty normal high school, but it wasn't. It wasn't pretty normal, but it was pretty normal on the kind of math side, right? So we did algebra and trig, and then you could take AP calculus and whatever. So I remember some of this stuff. C squared equals A squared plus B squared, right? So I was with a friend of mine. We were both teaching philosophy, and this guy does a lot of math. He now teaches at Thomas Aquinas College. And he says, "Do you know what that means?" And I'm like, "No, I could probably give you the solve for x part of it too, right? The negative b plus or minus, right? I could probably find that somewhere. But I remember the formula, right? So he draws a right triangle on it, and he says, it means this. And then he takes one of the sides and he puts a square. I'm like, what are you doing? He goes, that's a squared. I'm like, what? He says, it's an area. It's talking about an area. Like, nobody ever told me that. I would have remembered that. Right? So it means that this square is this area and this area added to each other. And that's a property that's only of this type of triangle. Like every one of these triangles, the square of the sides added together is that, right? Is the square of the hypotenuse. And I'm like, okay, there's a huge difference between memorizing that formula and plugging it in and getting the grade I wanted and moving on and having these numbers and letters dancing around in my head and actually knowing that that means something. In the real world, actually.
It's descriptive of a reality.
Right, yeah, it's talking about something that exists. And I remember feeling cheated. He says, you never took geometry? I'm like, yeah, we did conic sections and whatever, but I'm sure, don't even continue, Mike, right? I'm sure you're going to now blow me out of the water with something like that, right? But it used to be that before we even got to that type of thing, people did Euclid, right? And they were able to prove these things. And it was something that you understood it from the inside because you were able to follow these steps. And my son, who's doing that now as a sophomore, he's going to take with him a lot greater understanding and habits of mind than that. Now, I'm not a math person, but I did okay, right? And yet, it was plug and play for me, and they let it be plug and play for me. That's what I'm saying, right? Why was not more demanded of me? It's therapy for me too, not just Andy.
Thank you. We have one final announcement. Jordan, if you would like to step up.
Thank you, guys. You taught me more about geometry in the last 20 minutes than I learned in my 16 years of education. My mind just went, whoa. But if I have never met you guys before, my name is Jordan McHenry. My husband, Taylor, and I, we have 2 children. We've got Jack, who is 3 years old, and Miles will be 1 here next month. And I was talking to Father here about how excited we are to be a part of this parish and really start this school from the ground up and what it's going to look like. And he brought up the idea of having a parents group, and let's not wait 2+ years to start that, but let's start that now. And so we are going to run with that, and he mentioned a meet and greet. And so we're going to host a meet and greet at the park. It's Arbor Landing Park, right up the street here, Saturday, June 16th, right? 16th. Thank you. Thanks, Bryce. Saturday, June 16th, 10 a.m. Donuts will be provided, so if it's not enticing enough, please come for the donuts. Kiddos of all ages are welcome to join. It's not just the young ones, but the older ones as well. It's just a way to really create a community before the school's even built, and get to know one another, because I know I see your guys' faces all the time at church, but it's different out in the real world. So going to do that. Wanted to mention, this is in no way, you're not obligated to attend. If you're still discerning what school you're going to send your kids to, you can still come to this. I'm not going to come knock on your door in 2 years saying, here's your uniform, you came to the meet and greet 2 years ago. But as much as we, but the donuts, yeah. But yeah, if you guys just want to join this fellowship, we'd love to have you. Anything else?
That's it.
I think that's
Thank
it. Thank you, guys.
Thanks for attending.